All right. Judges chapter 19. What happened there? Just a brief thumbnail overview. There's a Levite involved. Who else is involved? Judges 19. Concubine. So the people of Gibeah, Benjamites, they're homosexual men. What ends up happening, the concubine's abused, she dies. The Levite, of course, cuts her up, sends her body parts throughout Israel, and there's this call for justice. And when they approach the tribe of Benjamin for justice, the tribe of Benjamin will not turn over the men who are guilty, and therefore, Judges 20 verses 18 to 21, they go to war and they have their first battle. They had turned to the Lord, these tribes did, to find out from Him, do we go out to battle? Who goes up? Well, Judah's to go up first. And in that first battle, there are 22,000 of that coalition that end up being killed. So Benjamin's able to fight them off and to kill 22,000 of that coalition. Then you have a second battle that takes place. They sought the Lord's guidance again. In that second battle, 18,000 from the coalition are killed. And so, though the Lord told them to go and to fight and to enter into this battle, the first two battles, they lose a significant number of people. And you have to wonder, why is that happening? Any ideas on why the Lord said go fight, but then they end up losing two battles in a row? I think it's because, Tom?
Make sure that God's in control.
Yeah, God's in control. Submit to Him. Trust in Him even when things don't go the way you want them to go. And there's an element there, potentially, of God humbling the entire nation. That, yes, the men of Gibeah are guilty, but it's not like the rest of you are innocent. And that you're doing everything you should be doing. You need to depend on God as you go out to this battle. Mike?
Setbacks along the way that nothing you cannot strive for justice and to burn out sin from your land. This is something they weren't used to. They were told to drive out those inhabitants, and they never did. And now all of these inhabitants kind of come their ways, kind of come into their society.
Right. It's not going to be any easy thing for you to purge this out. So they go to battle the third time, and they win that. Let's drop down to the end of chapter 20, verses 47 and 48. Who will read that? Judges 20, 47, 48. Carter, go ahead.
But 600 men turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon. And they stayed at the rock of Rimmon for 4 hours. And the men of Israel turned back against the children of Benjamin, and struck them down with the edge of the sword. Every city, men and beasts, all who were found. They also set fire to all the cities they came to.
Okay. So remember, it says in verse 46 that in that third battle, 25,000 of the Benjamites had died. If you go back and you look at all the numbers, that means in the first two battles, there were a certain number of Benjamites that had been killed in those first couple of battles, but it was relatively insignificant compared to losses on the other side. But here they lose 25,000. And I had asked that question, what was their condition after this battle? Of course, how many men are left of Benjamin? This is men of fighting age, but 600. You imagine that. It just cuts them all the way down to 600. And what was the problem with that? As the next chapter reveals. And it's not just the Benjamites who recognize there's a problem, but everybody else. chapter 21, verse 6. Who's got that? Elijah, you want to read that?
And the children of Israel grieved for Benjamin their brother, and said, one tribe is cut off from Israel today.
Okay. So what do they recognize? What's their fear here? Mike?
They've been decimated to a point they may not be able to control.
Yeah, it's bad. They recognize, in spite of all these things, now remember, this is set within that early time, really before the judges come to the fore. But they have enough understanding that God's will was that we as the tribes come in and possess this land, and we have a territory that we possess, and that's to be passed down through the generations, and that's part of our identity as a nation. And if one of the tribes is wiped out, well, that takes away from us as a nation. For us, I don't know, the closest thing may be, for instance, if the state of Florida was just decimated, wiped out, and gone. Well, we wouldn't want that. They don't want Benjamin. I mean, these are their relatives, on top of the fact it's another territory in their nation. But they don't want to see that happen. They're mourning and weeping over that. And so what's the remedy that they come up with?
They can't give their dollars to their wives, so they take their dollars. They take my dollars as their wives.
Well, but then you go on down here and it says, okay, we've sworn an oath. We can't give our daughters to them. And so who is it that didn't come out to fight with us in this battle? They're fair game. And they found out, well, it's Jabesh Gilead didn't come out and fight. And so let's go kill all them and take their women who haven't known a man and give them to the Benjamites. And remember, there's 400 of them that they ended up taking out of Jabesh Gilead. Well, there's still 200 left. How do we solve that? What's the next solution they come up with? There's a feast in Shiloh, and the young virgins go out in that feast, and they're in the field, and so the Benjamites were there in hiding, and they go and they just kidnap them. Any thoughts on these two methods, Philip?
They consult the Lord when they want to attack Benjamin, which they should attack him. But when this comes up, they don't consult.
No, there's no record of that, is there? Just like, hey, let's go do this. It may be the Lord might have told them, no, you can't do that. We don't know because they didn't ask. But any other thoughts there? Does it trouble you the way they solved this problem? It seems weird, doesn't it? And it seems ungodly, unrighteous. You think about if your daughter was one of the ones that was snatched and kidnapped and taken away. I would be furious over something like that happening. Philip.
It's right in with the theme of Judges, though. Every man did what was right in his own eyes.
Thank you. Verse 25, right? Why does it say every man did what was right in his own eyes? There's no king. What's that getting at?
There was no leadership. They were not submissive to authority. So therefore, they were free in their own imaginations to pursue whatever desires they wanted and how to go about fulfilling those desires, as we see here.
Exactly. There's no authority. They're not following an authority, and there's no central authority that was there to uphold and enforce and to lead by example what it was to be a follower of the law of God and to do God's will. That was wrong.
Stephen, even in political systems, there's a check and a balance, to validate the things that you're purposing to do. And go back to a foundation, which of course they depart from God's word, to verify whatever their actions are. And as Philip mentioned, they did not consult God. They're just, again, pursuing things in their own judgment.
Exactly right. And the idea was, if you go back to the law, and you go back specifically to the book of Deuteronomy, God anticipated, and he had a plan at some point for kings to rule over them, because he gives regulations for the king, including he had to make his own copy of the law. He needed to be meditating upon that law, following that law. And so the king's duty was to know it, to live it, to enforce it in the land. Now, when you get into 1 Samuel, the people have the wrong motivation for having a king over them. It's because they wanted to be like the nations around them, not so they could be closer to God and honor God and serve God and have a leader who's honoring God. That wasn't their motivation at all. So sometimes I think we get this idea that God never wanted a king over Israel. Well, it's built into the law itself. And here you have a time when it's showing very clearly through the book of Judges, there needs to be someone in place to enforce the law of God. Because these people are not doing it on their own. They should have done it on their own, but they're not doing it on their own. And so you have this chaos, everybody following what they want to follow. Zach, and then I've got one more comment.
We see the wisdom in that via elders over a church. When there is no leadership, or there is ungodly leadership, the men of that congregation or the strong women in the congregation, or a combination of the two, will run the church, quote unquote, and it'll spiral downward into chaos. And so when we have faithful elders to be thankful and submissive to, things will stay in order. And the sheep will hear the shepherd's voice. When the sheep stop hearing the shepherd's voice, it just turns into a big mess. And I've seen it, and I'm sure other people have seen it.
Right. And there are varying degrees of dysfunctionality when there are no elders in a congregation. Some of them are absolutely horrific. Others are, it's just not operating optimally as it should be, as scripturally organized. But Romans 13, what does Romans 13 say is the role, the purpose of government? Do you remember?
Well, to protect the ones who are in.
Okay, uphold good, suppress evil, right? That's been true from the very beginning. That fundamental principle has not changed. And so the king among the Israelites was to be dedicated to doing that. And it's not here. Chaos and anarchy is a terrible existence. You know, some people think tyranny is the worst thing. I'm not so sure tyranny is the worst thing. You look at the book of Judges and what's happening there, and that's awful. You know, we look at authoritarian regimes and we think, well, the people's freedom is oppressed. Well, that's true in many aspects, but it's also true authoritarian regimes tend to keep crime and these types of things in Judges 19 from happening. They tend to do that. And so we have to have a healthy perspective on this. And I want to tell you that when it says, in those days, everyone did what was right in his own eyes, that's a libertarian viewpoint. You know, sometimes you run across Christians who get into this idea, well, I'm libertarian. Wait a second. How can you be libertarian? Well, everyone just should be allowed to do what they want to do. Okay, so prostitution and drug use, are you telling me that that's okay? Because that's a libertarian position. Everyone just gets to do what's right in their own eyes. Transgenderism is a libertarian position. So we need to think about, wait a second, law and authority and government enforcing those things is a good thing. And we need that. It helps keep society in check. Any other thoughts? All right, let's jump into the book of Ruth. We have the context for Ruth here as we've closed out Judges, because it does take place, Ruth 1 verse 1, in the days of the Judges. It's interesting that this account is separated out from the book of Judges, though it took place within that time frame. And the reason is because the Holy Spirit's trying to highlight for us, here's something very important to note about that time period, and it's set in sharp contrast to what's going on in all the rest of those cases that we've read about. And by the way, in verse 1, Ruth 1 verse 1, let's just read 1 and 2 to start with. 1 and 2, we'll grab a couple things. Who's got that? Paul?
Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Benjamin, Judea, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was the name of the wife was Moab.
Just press on through, Paul.
Bethlehem and Judah, and they went to the country of Moab. They remained there.
All right. So, first of all, it says there's a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah. Does that ring a bell for anybody?
The priest that Micah hired was from Bethlehem. The Levites also.
Okay. It's very interesting that Judges 17 to 21 are connected to Bethlehem of Judah, and here it opens up with Bethlehem of Judah. There's a tie-in here and saying, look at these different things happening around this area here. Whether they're in the same time frame or not, it's the idea of here's a connection between these things. But it's a bridge. The book of Ruth is a bridge between Judges and Samuel to show what was happening. There's brighter days ahead, and there's a reminder that there's a remnant in the land. Even though you read in Judges, all this chaos and unrighteousness, and everyone's doing what is right in his own eyes, we understand that that's a general thing. Paul, you and I are having trouble this morning. But it's not saying that every single person was in rebellion against God and involved in sin and wickedness and idolatry. It's just saying that's the lay of the land. Now here, the book of Ruth is an exception. They are not that way. Here's some people who were living by God's law. So question number 1, I had asked, where is Ruth mentioned in the New Testament? And I would add, why is that significant? Where is she mentioned? Okay, where is that? Matthew 1, verse 5. Okay, so she's mentioning that. Why is it significant that she's mentioned in that genealogy? Female. She's one of 3 females, I believe, mentioned.
Not Israelite, she's from Moab.
Exactly, not an Israelite, Moab. Who's another female mentioned in there that's like, whoa? Rahab the harlot, who was not an Israelite. That was part of that is showing that God worked it out His way. Man, the Israelites wouldn't have chosen that genealogy for the Messiah. Hey, no, what? Somebody who was a harlot and somebody who was a Moabitess? No. But God worked that out. But it is significant that she's mentioned there, and that's an indication by the Holy Spirit this is an important person. Look at her. Look at Rahab. Look at Ruth. They were women of faith. That's why they're in there. Mike?
It's also important that they submitted themselves to God's law. That who they were was different than what they were.
Yes, exactly. They overcame their background to become faithful servants of God. Exactly right. Good point. And so Ruth is not mentioned in any other Old Testament book. She's not mentioned in any other New Testament book, but she is put in there in that genealogy of Christ, and helping us to see that this account in Ruth is not just simply a love story of, Boaz and Ruth and the woman who's downtrodden and being uplifted and greatly blessed and finding her Prince Charming, if you will, that kind of thing. That's not really what the book of Ruth is about. And it's not a drama of family life in the midst of hardships. That's in there, but that's not what the book of Ruth is really about. There are important lessons about faith and about God's working through ordinary people to bring about His plan of redemption, because this is helping us to see, how did Ruth come into that genealogy of Christ? How is it that her grandson became, David rises up to be king? What's going on? How did that even come about? Well, this helps us understand that and why God allowed that to happen, why He's working that out. And so there are people who have faith even in the midst of wicked times. And another thing we see in this book is that suffering is common to all of mankind. People react differently in that suffering. Some people react with bitterness and resentment, and other people react with faith, in a growing faith through those trials. You see that in Naomi and Ruth. Very, very different reactions to what happens to them. And so let's dive in now and think about this. It mentioned there in verse 1 that there was a famine in the land. I asked you in question 2, look up the meaning of Bethlehem and note the irony with what is happening in the land. So what is Bethlehem? House of bread. Yeah, exactly, which isn't the case here. Now, why, knowing your Bible history, why would there be a famine in the land? Yeah. Right, exactly. So you think about, it's the time of the judges, that the people face consequences for departing from His law. And here it says there's a famine in the land. We just got through everyone doing what was right in his own eyes. So there are problems here. God worked in the natural world to bring about suffering to get His people to wake up. You need to turn back to me. But it hyper focuses on one man and his family and what happens with that family through this time. So what is it that Elimelech does along with his wife Naomi and sons Mahlon and Chilion? That's how I'm going to pronounce them. You can pronounce them how you like. So what do they do in response to this famine? Leave. Leave for greener pastures. Okay, but they don't just leave, but what do they do here? It's not like they go from Bethlehem of Judah to the mountains of Ephraim, or they go to a foreign nation over here. They head east, southeast from where they were. So they're headed over to Moab to find refuge. Evidently there is, green grass, or there's crops, or there's opportunity there. And when they're there, what ends up happening to them? Okay, we're going to look at that in just a little bit. Let me ask you something. This hardship in the land, do you think it was difficult for them to leave Bethlehem of Judah? What was there in Bethlehem of Judah? For them, for Elimelech and Naomi and family, extended family, support system. Anything else? Their inheritance. Right. How do people generally feel about land, especially land that's been passed down through the family for generations? Yeah, I mean, it's dirt, but it's more than dirt. Mike?
It's the same sights, the same smells, the same sounds that your ancestors have seen all the way down through however long it's been.
Yeah.
So there's something very special about it. I feel very attached.
Yeah. Paul?
Possession.
Yes. There's a lot. Ron?
See, the other thing that, as the book reveals to us, and Naomi recognizes when she's talking to her daughters-in-law, is the complete contrast in life, in social, in structure, in serving God, and everything about their life. They left and went to a foreign nation. And that is a very difficult thing to do, to your point. Abandoned all that they had, all of the culture, all of their practices, and left it.
Yes. So there is a surrounding culture that they fit into, that they have to leave now and go to a foreign land. Elaine?
Sojourn means to come back, to travel with the intention of coming back.
Yes. They go over there for a time till this famine ends up. And as we read later, Naomi hears there's bread now. And so she's headed back since her family's gone. Mike?
Knowing where she is in the timeline, also, there was a lot of corruption that was probably going on. So I won't say it was easy, but if you're a faithful follower of God, and saying, we can't stay here, first of all, because of corruption around us and how this family's happening. You get a different perspective.
Yeah, and something that I think some of us can appreciate, others of us don't have as much of an appreciation. If you've never been to a foreign culture, Canada doesn't count. And most of Western Europe, I would say, doesn't really count. But if you go to a Middle Eastern country, or if you go to a Southeast Asian country, that's different. The people look different. They have different religious things. But even if you go to like Western Europe, there's enough of a contrast now. You're in a foreign land. Not just the language. I mean, the way the people look, the way they dress, the way they interact, the way they behave, just the activities that they're involved in, the pace of life and things. And so we have to appreciate this is quite a shift for them to go over to Moab out of Israel and to be there. Elimelech, his name means what? Does anybody have a footnote on that? Yes, God is king. And so he had parents of faith, evidently, that named him in a way that said God is king. And you see this faith play out because Ruth didn't get her faith just by osmosis. She got her faith somehow. And Elimelech, being the patriarch of the family, he's the guy we need to understand is passing on that faith that Naomi had, though it wavers, and she has some bitterness, that there is a connection there in a man having faith and influencing his family, his daughters-in-law even. Naomi means what? Pleasant, my delight, or lovely. Exactly right. So let's read verses 3 through 5 here. Ruth 1, 3 through 5. Who's got that? Carter.
Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her two sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The woman of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so the woman survived her two sons and her husband.
Okay. So describe her situation here.
She's in a moment of crisis. She lost her husband. Under the old law, and God commanded not to marry into the pagan culture, but produce a sense of being married. Now, God had a bigger plan here, and we'll learn about that as we read Ruth. But she was the one who married her sons to, pagan people. Ruth and I found that interesting, that she was during a time of crisis. Is that a moment where maybe her faith wavered? She maybe felt like that was the right thing to do, even though in some way more of a country God's law.
I think the women of Moab were okay to marry. But I'll have to double check that. But her situation right now is she's lost her husband, so she's a widow. She's lost her 2 sons, which is tragic and unnatural. The natural thing is for the parents to die before the children. And so there's that pain upon pain. And then as a woman in a foreign land, what's her situation? She has those daughters-in-law that maybe extended family would look out for her, but she's in a very precarious situation. How do I provide for myself? It's not like she could go out. And the other thing is you get down in here and she tells them, she has a conversation with them. One of the things you realize is she's up in the years. It's not as though she's a young woman who maybe would remarry and continue on with a husband to look after her. She's in a bad situation. Philip and Nancy.
The law of Moses actually kind of spells out a support structure for widows like this. But
To your point, being in a foreign land, she's away from that. She has no support structure.
Exactly. And we'll talk about that idea of returning in a little bit that engages that support structure.
The Moabites were the descendants of Lot, so Lot was the nephew of Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, there was a link with Israel.
Yes, they are distant relatives, distant cousins of them down through those generations. It wasn't like the prohibition against marrying the Canaanites and the Philistines and the Hivites and the Jebusites and all of that the Lord has said, don't marry the people of the land. These are people outside that land of Canaan. Do you have another thought, Ron?
I was going to say just what you mentioned, Stephen, that they were outside of Canaan, where God told them not to, within the area of Canaan. Those nations.
Right. There was a prohibition for a certain number of generations. I want to say it was like 10 generations. Mike?
yeah, so Deuteronomy 23, I think what everybody is referencing there, it specifically mentions the Ammonites and the Moabites, that they cannot come into the assembly of the Lord.
Right.
All the way down to the 10th generation. But it does not say they can't marry.
Right. The assembly is the idea of the worship involved in that worship. Yes.
Well, the Canaanites said you are not married.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Enter in certain things with the Moabites and Ammonites also.
Right. Now, to Cruz's point, there was the idea that you need to be marrying within Israel. That's your primary, relationships that you need to build and preserve that inheritance in the land and everything like that. But here they are in this foreign land. The boys are there. They marry women of that land. So they've settled in there for some time. It says that they're there, 10 years has passed by at this time. And one of the things is that there's no sons born to her sons. So there's no heirs. There's no grandchildren. So that in and of itself for Naomi is a tragedy. because they highly prized, of course, having children, grandchildren, and passing on that family and the inheritance when they return back to the land. So there's heartache and loss that is there. Question number 3 I'd ask, reflect on Naomi's situation and list things in your life that relate to her circumstances. What struggles come with these things? Anybody want to share any of that?
Naomi has lost her family. It's very upset, and she was heartbroken. It's easy, when we go, everybody goes through trials and loss. When we go through those things, it's easy to become bitter. And we see that she was, in a sense, saying that God had dealt harshly with her, almost laying blame on God. And that's a very dangerous place to be in. And I believe that Ruth staying with her actually helped her to be safe.
Okay, so has anybody here experienced famine? I know there are people here lost a spouse. There are people here potentially lose children. Maybe even miscarriage is a painful and difficult thing to go through, let alone your children older and you lose those children, disease, accident, whatnot. When people go through a divorce, even if it's your spouse has committed adultery and you put them away, extremely painful. And those kinds of things can bring about bitterness, as Carrie's pointing out. It could be that you have marital problems. And you think, why? Why? There are things in life that are extremely difficult to deal with. Emotionally, it's so painful, so deep. And it's not something that in a week or 2 weeks or 6 months or a year, maybe even the rest of your life, that it's not going to be with you day in and day out. It may be something you think about every day or you think about it very frequently. Some people who sort of hold on to that, it wrecks their life. They can't function because they become bitter, and that's what their whole life revolves around. Naomi's in great danger of that as we see this unfold here. And so we need to be careful, need to be aware. Satan will try to take advantage of these kinds of things to cause us to turn away from the Lord, become embittered toward Him. But also to realize, what I have experienced, other people experience similar things. Other people have gone through hardships, difficulties, tragedies. And it's hard for me to imagine this woman who's gone to this foreign land because of famine, and now her husband dies. Okay, that's painful enough, but at least she has her sons, and then her 2 sons die, and she's kind of there by herself. Very hard to deal with. And some family sometimes becomes bitter. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. Any other thoughts before we press on? Ron?
Stephen, as I was thinking about this, in addition to some of the things you were mentioning, is also when people look at their lives and they want to hopefully improve upon their lives, they make decisions to move to an area without fully understanding the associated ramifications with that move, which could potentially be even the destruction of their own family spiritually because of that. Yes. Literally,
in this case, the grass is greener. I think somebody mentioned that a while ago. The grass was greener over here. But sometimes we think the grass is greener. And maybe it is. Maybe there is, let's just put it in the context of financial, maybe there is more money in that job in that other city. But the church is weak, and there's only one there, one option of a congregation that you could be with and assemble with, but it's weak. Maybe it doesn't have elders in it, whereas where you are, there's elders. It's a stronger, active congregation. And sometimes people make really poor decisions in their life for the wrong reasons. So, all right, any other thoughts there? All right, let's read verses 6 through 13, please. 6 through 13. Who will grab that for us? Ron?
Then she rose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Now Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. So she kissed them and lifted up their voice. They lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, Surely we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight, and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they are grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me.
Okay. So Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth start on their journey back to Jerusalem, or back to Judah, I should say. Because she recognized, she heard the Lord had given his people bread. He's visited them. There are fruitful times. There's sustenance there. So question number 4, why did Naomi urge her daughters-in-law to go back to their own families, and specifically to their mother's house, which seems to indicate that their fathers had passed away, but they had a broader family they could go to. But why did she tell them to do that, Paul?
Well, there's food, there's a living. They can survive till they find a husband.
Okay, go back to your family, your support system. Any other thoughts, Tom?
You don't want to be around me. I got this cloud of death with son to live.
Yes. What does that tell you about Naomi and her view of her daughters-in-law? She really loved them, didn't she? She wants the best for them to survive and be okay and looked after. And she's basically saying, I can't do that. I have no power here.
And they were reciprocating that love to her as well, weren't they, Stephen?
Yes.
As we see here.
Yeah, these are good relationships between them. And so when we read about Orpah turning back, that wasn't because she didn't love Ruth or didn't care about Ruth. She made a personal decision, I'm headed back.
I think it shows that all three of these men, the father, the two sons, they did a very good job of choosing very good wives.
Yes. This family is a close, loving, caring family. Exactly right. And so she's telling him, you got to go back because I can't help you. I can't provide. I've got this big black cloud over me, to Tom's point. And even if I had the prospect of having a husband, bearing children, are you going to wait for the next 18 to 20 years? And then you'll be 18 to 20 years old. And for another husband from me? No. That's not going to work. Because remember, under the law, if a son died and he had no heirs, his brother was to take him. And that's what she's really referencing back to here, saying it's just not going to happen. So she's recognizing it's a bad situation. She's trying to think of them, what's going to be best for them. They're a very emotional time. Both of them, of course, state that they would go with her. But then she continues on saying to them, no, you need to go on back. Don't come with me. Let's read, I tell you what, verses 14 to 18 here. 14 to 18. Who will get that for us? Go ahead, Philip.
Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her.
All right. So question 5 was, why did Ruth stay?
To me, the key point to that, Stephen, in your question is in verse 16, where she says, and your God, my God, is that Ruth had a foundational belief in the true and living God. She had developed faith and confidence in God, and is stating that here in her reply to Naomi.
Yes, absolutely. It's a display of her absolute faith in the one true God. Anything to add to that, Mike?
Well, it's also, when you look at the evidence, what she was seeing was that nation under a famine, her nation Israel. So what possible reason she had to follow her God? But we see something in Naomi and that whole family lineage, that how the type of people that they were is probably what changed her into this is something great and good for me.
Yes, and I'm going to go, it's interesting, she says, your people will be my people. Well, she's in the family, and it seems this is a broader context of I'm joining the nation of Israel. So she's a proselyte. She's being brought in and folded in, and she's going to observe the law. She's going to be there and dwell in that land of promise, that Canaan land that the Lord had given them. And your God is my God. So to Ron's point, this is a full statement of faith here. And it talks about her clinging to Naomi. She's attached to her now. Philip.
A random aside. She's a Moabite, but if you take that she's going to be a proselyte, with Deuteronomy and 10th generation still apply.
It would apply. It would apply, but I don't know what generation this is. I don't fully know that. But anyway, Lord willing, we'll pick up there, press on into chapter 2 next week.